I'd like to ask Frank Braeken, again, he's the Chief Investment Officer of Amatheon Agri Holding, to give us his remarks.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank the Rockefeller Foundation for setting up this discussion, because as some of you might know, I've been writing a little bit about my concern in the discussions around the African miracle. I've become increasingly concerned about us evading the real debates and being bogged down in the old statistics and rehashing it, etc. So I see this really as an example of the next level of debate that really is absolutely urgent in Africa, or the miracle will become a mirage. So first of all, thank you for that. Inclusiveness is, of course, the real Africa challenge, because the fact is what it is. The level of poverty is not declining. And whilst we are very proud about the growth levels that Africa is taking in, 5 or 6%, it's just not enough. It's not enough to even keep up with population growth. And you will see me referring often to China, because I've spent 4 formative years in China, whilst China was growing very fast. But the China government realized very much that just to improve the general well-being of the population, 8% growth was required, and at a much lower population growth. So I think we should be very careful in being jubilant about 6%, because the reality, statistically, it's not enough. I had the good fortune of living in several countries in all shades of gray in terms of inclusiveness, from Switzerland, Colombia, China, England, Colombia, Africa, you name it. So I've had some personal experience around what are the key drivers about exclusiveness, and these are personal observations. I think that inclusive economies in itself is a somewhat of a too narrow debate, because it's actually about inclusive societies. Inclusive economies can only exist and persist in societies who have a real vision about inclusiveness, who believe in structural values such as equality and meritocracy. And one of the key questions that African countries and African societies must ask themselves is, are they really, as a society, dedicated to these inclusive values, or are they actually dedicated to values of exclusivity? I think that, unfortunately for Africa, we have all been caught up in a sort of an ideological debate about the role of government. On the one hand, the role of government should be small. You all have followed the US debate about small government versus big government, including in Europe. And in some ways, Africa is being caught up on it. But I do think that the whole debate about inclusive societies and inclusive economies is actually about the role of government. And I personally, as a European, I believe that at the core of the role of government is creating inclusiveness. So my plea is actually, strangely enough, as a representative of the private sector, is I do believe in big government in that sense. Now, unfortunately, of course, Africa did not have the good fortune, like Europe, of having a serious shock treatment like a Second World War that shook the society in such a way that we did have to choose for inclusiveness. Unfortunately, Africa has that. Africa has a history which is very different, and in some ways, as some of the earlier speakers says, actually in some ways drives us away from inclusiveness. Now, I do think that when I refer to government as a strong government, now obviously, then I should also dare to frame a couple of actions that that government should be engaging in. First of all, I would say, I think we have to stop this obsession with foreign direct investment. I'm really worried about that. All the discussion is about the billions of dollars that are needed and should come in. And of course, Africa needs foreign direct investment. But as much as it needs that, what it needs is an influx of know-how. Again, I refer to my China experience, the country that, like no other country in history, has lifted people out of poverty. And let this not be a debate about political systems, but the fact is, the statistics say it clearly, it lifted massive amounts of people out of poverty. Now, What was the real, I think, the real story behind the China's success is their obsession with know-how. More than us being there, us expatriates, multinationals, that was my Unilever time, more than us being invited for the capital is we were invited for the know-how we were bringing. And I think Africa needs to have the same self-confidence to really say to the whole world, come, bring us your know-how, bring us your experience, bring us your expertise. And part of that is, of course, the diaspora. Isn't it one of the saddest things about Africa is that so much brain power sits outside Africa? Unlike in many other countries, whether it is East Europe after the fall of the communist wall or China, where many of this brain drain came back, in Africa this has not yet happened. So my plea would be for a debate much more focused on how can Africa attract know-how and brains as much as capital. Secondly, Africa must drive capital efficiency. Capital is expensive. And you know, all these billions that we are now putting into Africa, they need a return. They are going to put a mortgage on the future as well. This is about dividends and this is about shareholders. So why do we have so much capital that is underutilized whilst we keep on pouring in more? Drive capital efficiency. Governments need to revise tax regulations. I've been in situations where we have been encouraged to destroy employment and put in case packers and the most modern factory in South Africa. Why? Because tax regulations and tax incentives encourage it. Increase the tax base. Strange, may sound strange, but how can a government drive inclusiveness if the tax base is less than 10%, 20%? The government must have more taxes to work with. Ensure property rights. The base of inclusiveness for many poor people, the first base is the piece of land they have and the house they have. Make them work with it. Give them property rights so that they can leverage it. Consumer protection and fight against monopolies. Nowhere else than in Africa are consumers taken for a ride. It's incredible how the poorest people pay the highest prices for basic stuff. Check the price of cement in many countries and you will understand why it makes millionaires. Last but not least, governments should do everything possible to tilt the balance of power towards the young and the women. Because I do really think that whenever we are not happy with the status quo, it's always better to bank on the ideas of the young than on the wisdom of the olds. So I have framed a lot of my remarks into my words. There was one point that I wanted to pick up on, and that was not in my initial remarks, if you allow me. African firms should participate in the value chains. Let me debunk one other general thought about Africa I disagree with, that the African solution is about entrepreneurship. I disagree. I have nowhere else seen so much entrepreneurship than in Africa. The solution is in managership. What Africa needs is more managers who can bring businesses who are today 1 million into 5 million, into 100 million, into 500 million. Thank you.